I'm Liselle Sambury. I'm a traditionally published author, and welcome to this video about how I make money as a full-time author 2022 edition. So I did this video last year, which was the 2021 edition, and I will link that down below if you'd like to check that out. But essentially the story of this video is I decided to write as my full-time job, basically, and started that from the beginning of 2021. And so essentially I've now been doing this full time for 2 years. And I thought it would be interesting to just kind of share where my different kind of income sources come from and like what goes to taxes and what I take home, etc., just to kind of give an idea of that. I'm someone who was curious about those sorts of things before I was writing full time, so I thought it'd be fun to do this video. And the first one I did seemed to be pretty popular, so I figured I would do it again this year. So that's the story of that. And I will start off just with sharing some little disclaimers for the video. So first things first, I will say I am not going to be stating my exact income. I'm not going to be sharing how much I make because to me that's private to me and it's my channel and I don't want to. But I will be sharing percentages so you can kind of get an idea of how much each kind of income source contributes to my overall income. I will also say that I'm not a financial professional. I'm not an accountant. I'm not any of those things. So I am not here giving like backed up financial advice or anything like that. I'm just sharing my experience, and if that helps you in some way, that is fantastic, but I am not a financial professional, which I think is important to say. And then as a last disclaimer, I'd like to just share some of the privileges that allow me to do this, because I do think it's really important to kind of give a full picture as to what allows me to write full time. So I'll say that I live in Canada, and so I have access to universal health care. I'm also additionally on my partner's insurance. And so because of that, I have kind of a well-rounded access to healthcare. I also live in a place that has a low cost of living, and so my cost of living is not very high. Additionally, me and my partner split expenses, so it is important to me to have an income. We wouldn't subsist off of one income only, but we do split expenses, which makes things cheaper naturally. I also, as a part of living in Canada, I have access to grants so arts grants, whether those be kind of national or provincial. And that's another thing that people may not have access to in their country. And then kind of the last bit is that if something, emergency happened and I became destitute, I do have family that would help me. And so I do have a safety net. I wouldn't kind of be out in the cold. I would, if there was an emergency, I would have help from families. Editing Liselle, just jumping in really quick to say that I also do not have dependents. So I don't have children or anyone that I am taking care of. So just wanted to share that because I feel like it helps give a kind of complete picture of what makes this possible for me. So what this video is going to be. So I'm going to share my 2022, my income sources. So the sources of my income. I'm also going to share an income breakdown, which is things like taxes and like retirement, etc. And then because I now have data from 2021, I'm going to do a little comparison just so we can kind of see how that will compare. And then at the end, I'll just share some of the kind of things that I learned and things that I might change or handle better in the future and things that kind of worked for me. Okay, so now I should be a fun little floating head in the corner, and I have this pie chart up here. I'm just gonna quickly read out everything on the pie chart just in case you're visually impaired and can't see all of that. And then after I've read that out, I'll talk a bit more at a length about each of those sections. So the advanced portion of my income accounts for 53.4% of my total income. YouTube is 0.5%. Royalties are 18.3%. Honorariums are 4.3%. Grants are 19.3%, and bonus is 4.1%. Sorry if you noticed me looking down at my iPad, it was just so I could read everything out. So now I'll just talk a bit about each of those. So the largest portion that of my income does come from advances. So if you don't know, an advance is an advance against royalties. So in traditional publishing, for the most part, though not necessarily all the time, but for the most part, you will be given an advance when the publisher buys your book. And so this advance is kind of a lump sum amount of money. It'll usually be split into several different payments. When you get those payments depends on many different factors. So you can get a payment, for example, when you sign the contract. You can get a payment upon completion of the manuscript, which is really when the manuscript goes to copy edits. You can get a payment when the book is published, and you can get a payment like a year or 2 years after publication. Those kind of milestones will be decided between you and the publisher in that negotiation process. But that advance is that lump sum, and every book that you sell contributes to that lump sum. And when you have sold enough books to equal that amount, then you start to receive royalties. So then you receive a percentage of each book. And that advance contribution is not the whole cost of the book. So it's a percentage that you get. So for example, if you have a $20 book and you get 10% of your sales, then you'll have like $2 contributed towards the advance for every book sale. So that's pretty much how that works. So I had several different projects that I got advances for. So I had my original work that I do through my publisher. I had an IP project. So I worked on a He-Man book. And so that was an intellectual property project because I don't own the rights to He-Man. So I wrote that book. I was hired to write that book. And then also I was asked to be in some anthologies. So some of those advance payments came from anthologies as well. And so I got 5 separate advance payments in 2022, and that made up that figure that you see and made up the bulk of my income, which I think will pretty much always be the case just because it's a large lump sum payment. And so I feel like it's generally going to make up the largest amount of my income. And then the bonus. So that bonus is in regards to a sort of contractual bonus. So in traditional publishing, there are all sorts of ways that you can get bonuses. So some authors receive bonuses for hitting certain bestseller lists or for getting nominated for awards. You can also get bonuses for earning out of your book. Earning out means you earn out your advance and can start getting royalties. So earning out your advance in a specific period of time. Bonuses are something that your literary agent or yourself, if you're representing yourself, would try and negotiate. So not everybody has bonuses in their contract, but some people do, and I did. And so I received a bonus in 2022. So that is what that bonus amount is. And then royalties. So royalties, because Blood Like Magic, which is my debut novel, earned out, I was able to start receiving royalties. And so I got 2 royalty payments in 2022, which was great because it meant that my book actually earned out quite quickly. And I was able to start receiving royalties. And so it's really interesting to me because the way that I had heard authors talk about royalties was really kind of like, royalties ain't shit. That was very much the impression that I got, was that royalties was basically pennies, and it wasn't really going to be a lot of money. And people really talked usually in the same breath about really relying on your advance payment, which I understand because the advance payment is going to be that large lump sum payment, and you have kind of specified times when you are supposed to get those payments. So it's a lot better to rely on. I would say my advance payment is kind of the only thing I rely on, even though that is technically in flux. So if your publisher pushes your book back, you might not get your advance payment for a lot longer than you expected. Or if you can't meet a deadline and that causes the book to be pushed, then you might not get your advance payment for a while. Things like that can affect payments, but in the scope of everything in traditional publishing that is kind of unpredictable, I find the advance payment to be the most predictable, and I do tend to count on it. And so that, I understand why people say that, but it kind of made it seem very much that a royalty was not going to be anything to write home about. And so I was really surprised because my royalties were very significant. They weren't as much as my advance, but they were very significant to me, and they were certainly not pennies, and they were certainly not chump change. Like you can see on the chart, that made up almost 20% of my income. So it's a very significant chunk of my income for 2022. And yeah, so I don't know if that's like I did especially well and like that's why it was so much more than expected, or if it's just like people that I'd heard talking about royalties not being very much were people that had really, really high advances, and so comparatively it didn't seem like a lot. I'm not really sure, and I had a modest advance for my Blood Like Magic, Blood Like Fate. It wasn't like some sort of gigantic amount, and so I don't know if that was the difference, but like for me personally, royalties was not chump change. Royalties was great, and I was very excited about getting royalties this year. So that's what I will say about that. And now on to the grant section. So in 2022, I was approved / received a grant from the Canada Council for the Arts. This was to work on my dark academia project that I called A Mastery of Monsters. And so I applied for that in 2021, late 2021. And then I learned whether or not I would be getting it in like early 2022. And so I got that grant, which was significant. The grants for me are really big helps for why I can continue to write full time. They make a huge difference. And during that time, I'm producing a project that I can then prepare to try and sell. And so it does make a really big difference in my income. And it's been like a huge help and a huge privilege and a huge honor for me. So I've been very thankful about the grants. If you are Canadian and you want to know more about these grants, I recommend going to the websites first and foremost, because those are going to have the most information. But if you kind of want to learn a little bit more about like my experience and like what I did and like my perspective on it, I'll link down below 2 things. So I'll link to my 2021 How I Make Money video with a timestamp where I talk more at length about the Canada Arts Grant and that process. And then I will also link to a TikTok video that I did more recently where I talked again in much more detail about that grant process. And so in Canada, like if you are in Ontario, because I'm in Ontario, so that's really what I know about, there's Canada Arts Grants. So there's a national grant, there are provincial grants or territorial grants. So there's grants in Ontario as well. And then I know if you live in Toronto, Toronto also has their own separate grants. So kind of like 3 levels of grants. So yeah, that was the whole grant process. And then honorariums. So honorariums are payments received for doing panels or interviews or things like that. For me, my honorariums come exclusively from things I do in Canada. I have yet to, I think I've received, I received 1 honorarium for a conference that I did in the US, and it was like a quite small honorarium, but still very much appreciated. And so that's kind of the only US one I've gotten, but most of my honorariums come from Canada and from doing events in Canada, almost entirely virtual. I think maybe I did have a couple in-person things. So yes, mostly virtual events. So things like panels or interviews. I also did 1 school visit virtually. And then I also did some peer reviewing for the Canada Arts Council, which I counted under this as well, though that honorarium was significantly more than my others, because usually those honorariums are like for me to appear online for like an hour. And so I'm being compensated for my time. And so it's just kind of an hour versus the peer review was a much larger time commitment, and so there was a larger time compensation. Honorariums honestly are great. They're really fantastic. I really appreciate them, especially because these are things I probably would have done anyway, because a lot of them are great promotion for my books. And so I probably would have agreed to them in any case, but it's nice to be compensated for my time. I also have a theory about why I get these in Canada all the time, but don't really in the US. And I think it's probably because in Canada, because we have access to the grants, I think a lot of places also apply for grants. And then then when they get the grants, they're able to compensate the artists. And so I think it kind of ends up being a circle in that way a little bit. But if you are in the United States, I know that I've heard many authors say to please charge for things like school visits. So that might be something that might generate income if you're in the US. And I'm not really sure about any other countries, but that's something you could potentially look into. But that's basically the honorarium section. And then the final income source is YouTube. I haven't had any sponsorships as of yet, so this is purely from AdSense. And so that's just what that portion represents, the AdSense chunk. Now we're going to go into the income breakdown section. So once again, I've got the chart on screen, but I'll just read out all the percentages first, and then I'll talk a bit more about each section. So the available money, so that accounts for 46.4% of my income. Taxes account for 24.4%. Savings account for 12.4%, and retirement accounts for 16.8%. And so this available money section, so this is kind of basically everything I have left over after I take out taxes, retirement, and savings, which I tend to take out first and then kind of see what I'm left over with. Or actually, I take out taxes and retirement first, and then I kind of see what I've got, and then I kind of gauge how much savings I'm going to pull out, and then I kind of work with whatever's left over. So that available money, what that is everything I use to pay for my expenses. So my bills and things like that. And then also what I call leisure money, which is just like whatever money I have left over that I use to spend for whatever. So sometimes this overflows into like emergency, unexpected bills. Sometimes this is me just buying whatever. And like sometimes it's me buying things that are technically business expenses. So things like books that I'll then write off later, but I still kind of just lump it in that way. It's just the system that works well for me. I know some authors prefer to have like a separate business credit card or a separate business account that they use just for whatever is going to count as business. I already have a lot of different accounts, and I honestly just didn't want to add even more. And so I just decided to keep it that way. But just so you can get kind of a better percentage breakdown of that. So pretty much of that available money chunk, 63% of that I use to pay for expenses and bills, things like that. And then 37% of that is like the leisure money. So just to kind of give you a little bit more of an idea of what of that chunk I actually use for bills and like what is just kind of floating for me to use however I want. So I'll talk about that retirement chunk. This is something that was kind of in flux throughout the year. So if if my income increased, then I would try and put more towards retirement. If my income increased, more and more and more, all with the goal of kind of maxing out my retirement level. So in Canada, just there are different ways that you can save for retirement. And just one of the ways that is available to me is kind of has like a maximum amount that you can put in every year. And so my goal was to put in that maximum amount, but I wasn't actually sure what I would be able to do. And so I kind of just went back and forth, but I was ultimately able to put in the maximum amount for that year. So that was great retirement wise. For savings, so I had a few set things that I put aside savings for this year. So I knew that I was going to be going on a writing retreat with friends, so I put aside a set amount of money for that. And then part of my Canada Arts grant was for traveling to Kingston to do research for my Dark Academia project. So I automatically put away part of the grant in order for that so that I could be able to afford that trip. And then I put away a little bit more just in case. I really did try and like put more away to savings this year that could like readily be used for anything. I don't know, active savings. It's not really savings that I'm putting somewhere to like sit and accrue. It was kind of just savings that I might actively need as I went throughout my life for things like trips and things like that. So that was really what I had put away into savings, though sometimes if I had an unexpected, emergency, I would pull from savings for things like that. So it's a very kind of flexible savings. This isn't really a savings that I put aside into like an investment account, for example, to sit it or anything like that. So that was what I had for savings. And then taxes. So what I've noted for taxes here is what I have calculated as my potential maximum amount of taxes that I'll pay. So this doesn't account for what I'm going to be writing off with my accountant, just because I'm not going to know that until like March of this year. And so I like to do these videos in the beginning of the year. And so I just figured I'll just leave it. So this is really an estimate of like the maximum amount of taxes, but I don't actually expect to pay this much. I do expect to pay less, but I make sure that I save and put away this much just in case. And yeah, so that's kind of how I work out that taxes bit. And so I'm always kind of keeping track of my overall income for the year as it changes, because the thing about being a full-time author is that sometimes you might sell something you didn't expect to sell, or be approached about a project you didn't expect to be approached by, and then suddenly your yearly income will change. And so I just keep track of that along with my taxes, so that I make sure that I'm constantly setting aside the amount I need. And I will say, for taxes in Canada versus what I've heard about business taxes in the US. So in Canada, I pay my taxes once per year, but I believe for businesses in the US, people pay like each quarter, just to also kind of give an overview of that. Now we're going to get into the comparison section. So I'm going to do a comparison of 2021 and 2022. I will say that from 2021 to 2022, I did have an increase in my income, my total amount. So I had a 14% increase. There's not really anything I think to say necessarily for why, except that I took on more projects on top of what I had already kind of planned to be paid in 2022, but I also had a lesser large chunk advance payment in 2022. So it just kind of ended up working out that way. But yeah, so I'll go ahead and I'll have both charts on screen for the income sources, and I'll just break down the differences between the two, and I'll just read those out, and then I'll talk about them at a greater length. So in 2021, advances accounted for 76.9% of my income, as opposed to 53.4% in 2022. In 2021, awards accounted for 0.9% of my income. There were no awards in 2022. In 2021, grants accounted for 20.2% of my income, as opposed to 19.3% of my income in 2022. In 2021, honorariums accounted for 1.3% of my income, as opposed to 4.3% of my income in 2022. And in 2021, YouTube AdSense accounted for 0.7% of my income, as opposed to 0.5% in 2022. And in 2021, I did not receive any royalties or any bonuses. I'm just going to talk generally about the kind of differences between 2021 and 2022. So I think definitely in 2022, there was a lot more spreading out of my income sources. Things felt a little bit more even. Obviously, the advance accounts for most of my income, which is understandable, and I expect that trend to continue in years to come. But it was kind of interesting to see a little bit more of a spread, because in 2021, my advance and grant were really the majority of my income, whereas now this year I had things like royalties and the bonus and a little bit more of an honorarium chunk, which I suspect is really a bigger chunk because I had done that peer review with the Canada Council for the Arts. So there was that. And yeah, so I think those were really the big differences between that year. And also, if I had broken down the advance bit more, like the 2021 advance section was really like one source, because it was my largest advance payment. And then the advance payment in 2022 was really like several different sources. And so even like within that, it was quite a bit more spread out, but otherwise pretty expected or normal. YouTube went down a little bit in 2022 because I changed the way I was posting. I had also taken a break in December of 2021, which I think messed up the algorithm for me in 2022. But otherwise, like, the differences were really just like having access to royalties and bonuses. And now for the income breakdown. So again, I'm just going to read out the figures. So in 2021, my take home or available money was 32.9% of my income, as opposed to 46.4% of my income in 2022. In 2021, savings was 11.4% of my income, as opposed to 12.4% in 2022. In 2021, retirement accounted for 43.8% of my income, as opposed to 16.8% in 2022. And in 2021, taxes accounted for 11.9% of my income, as opposed to 24.4% in 2022. So speaking generally again about those, I think the biggest kind of difference between 2021 and 2022 was how much I put into retirement. And that was really due to, as I said, the kind of way I save for retirement. It has a kind of maximum you can do each year. And in 2021, I had a higher maximum because I had never contributed to it before. Whereas in 2022, I had a lower maximum. So even though both years I contributed the maximum, they were different maximums. So that was really the big difference. I also think in 2021, I really panicked and had no idea what I was doing. And so I threw a bunch of money at retirement and just a full-on panic, versus I think in 2022 I was a little bit more understanding of things. So even though I technically did the same action, it felt more educated in 2022 than it did in 2021. Also, the taxes bit. So what I will say about 2021 is I incorrectly estimated the maximum of what I would pay in taxes. So what you see in the 2021 chart is actually exactly what I paid in taxes. I thought it was going to be way more, but I hadn't estimated my maximum properly, and I was really lucky that it ended up being exactly what I already had. So yeah, I think the 2022 one is estimated correctly, so it's more representative of a maximum payment. So I actually, if I had to guess, I'd say maybe it'll probably end up being a little bit closer to the 2021 one when it all comes together, but at the time I had incorrectly estimated it, so that's what it was. And I think those are really the only big stark differences between things. The savings does look similar, but I will say that I felt like I had much more access to my savings in 2022 than I did in 2021. I think in 2021, I had a lot more weird panic moments where I was having to panic use my savings and I wasn't keeping track of it well. Whereas in 2022, I felt like I had a much better handle on it. I was putting aside savings for certain things and I was budgeting it properly. So even though they look like a similar amount of savings, I felt like I had way more savings in 2022 compared to 2021, even though the figures are actually quite similar. But I think that's really it for those comparison bits. And then now I'll just talk a little bit more about what I learned during the process from 2021 to 2022. The first learning I had was about my taxes. So as I said, in 2021, I actually incorrectly estimated my taxes because I didn't exactly know how it worked. And I was kind of trying to surmise from various sources how it worked. And I was just wrong. I was very lucky and fortunate because I finally, to my accountant, I was like, how am I supposed to know what I'm going to pay in taxes? And she gave me access to this online resource, which I will link below. It's only useful for people in Canada. But what it does is that you can put in your annual income and it will give you an estimate of the amount of taxes it expects you to pay. This is, of course, the amount of taxes it expects you to pay if you wrote nothing off, which of course I plan to write things off, but I would rather have the maximum, put aside the maximum and be prepared than assume I'm going to get some magic number off that I can't calculate because I'm not an accountant and then not have that ready. So that tool I ended up starting to use. And essentially what I would do is that anytime I kind of received an amount of money, I would make sure to calculate what my annual earning was, incorporating that into it, and I would recalculate how many taxes I would owe, and I would adjust my accounts to put aside that money for taxes, because I have separate accounts. So I have an account that I keep my tax money in and my retirement money in, and I don't touch it. And then I can kind of add to it if I have more money and I can put more money in for retirement, or I have more money and I can put more money into other things. You know what I mean? So I just kind of put it there, and then kind of towards the end of the year, I make my official retirement payment, and then I keep my taxes kind of separately. So that was kind of what I did. And so I was constantly recalculating, because the thing about traditional publishing is you don't always know when you're going to suddenly get money. So like the advance payment, that's the like more predictable payment. Though even sometimes not really, because I have, some kind of outstanding payments that were supposed to happen that kind of haven't yet. And so sometimes things can go that way, but like that was mostly what I had accounted for. But if I got booked for an event and then suddenly I was going to get an honorarium, or if I suddenly got approved for the grant and so I suddenly got that amount of money, or I earned out a book and suddenly was receiving royalties, these were all things I would constantly recalculate to make sure that I was going to have enough tax money. And so that was something that I learned to do in 2022 that I think was very, very useful. Also, another little mistake that I made in 2021, which I wouldn't do it again. Other people, you can make your own choices. But I had thought the money that I was putting aside for taxes, I was like, well, it's just sitting in an account. So why don't I put it in an investment account? And then it can like make some money. And then that investment account promptly lost money. And so I was scrambling at tax time because I had pulled it out of the investment account. I was actually a little bit short, not a lot, enough that I like had enough excess money that I could make it up, but I potentially could have lost a chunk of money that I was gonna like pay to taxes. I was planning to pay to taxes. So for me personally, I don't care to put that money in investment accounts anymore. I think really the investment account for me is best for things that are long term that I'm not planning to touch ever, in which case the up and down, the daily up and downs, whatever, don't really matter. So that was something that just like for me personally, it didn't work out and I wouldn't do it again. So that was a learning for me. I'm very risk averse, but I know some people are not so much. So maybe they'll be more comfortable rolling the dice, but I was not comfortable rolling the dice and I wouldn't do that again. Also a learning for me was thinking about how my advance is broken up. So I've been really fortunate in that my advance breakdowns have been really favorable to me. Sometimes people don't really get super favorable ones and their advance is broken down really, really a lot. But I think I had a very favorable kind of contract. But in that process, I got a lot more money up front to get a little bit less later. And at the time I was like, yeah, more money up front. Of course I would want that. Why would I say no to that? And I later regretted it because I realized that if I had requested to have the payments split more evenly, I would have kind of had a very livable amount for the duration of that contract. Instead, what happened is I got an amount of money I really didn't need for that year in one year, and then not enough in the other years. And so that has created challenges for me, because then it was kind of, I was lucky in 2022 because projects came to me and so I didn't need to scramble. But it's kind of like it creates a scramble where I didn't need to necessarily have that. And so for me, if you're a traditionally published author, I would think a lot more long-term about how your advance payments are going to be broken up and what that's going to give you access to each year versus necessarily being like, of course I want the big payment up front, because you might not. However, I'm aware that some people might not want to do this for several reasons, but the big reason being that sometimes your contract can be canceled. And if your contract is canceled, you're never going to see those other payments. So then maybe you'll be mad that you didn't take the bigger payment up front. Or if you like miss deadlines and then your other payments might be pushed and then you might be upset that you didn't take the bigger payment up front. So it's all a gamble. But for me personally, for future contracts, I would definitely be looking at more of that equalness, because I don't expect to have things canceled, and I usually meet all my deadlines, so I don't really expect to have things pushed. But it is a kind of like a personal gamble because you have to decide how you want to do with that. But I think it's important to think about kind of long-term what you're going to have access to with your advance, because sometimes it may in fact be better to have more kind of equal payments than to have a larger payment up front. And finally, for my fellow Canadians, something that I did in 2022 that was extremely helpful to me is I got a cross-border bank account. And so if you're in Canada and you have a US publisher and you get paid in US, something that a lot of Canadian banks will do is that they will put holds on your money. And this was something that was like creating difficulties for me because the hold would be for like a month. So I would not have access to money for like a month after I had already been paid it. And so I ended up kind of talking with my bank, and what they suggested for me was this cross-border account. So I have a cross-border kind of checking account, and I also have a cross-border credit card. And for me, the great thing about this is that you can transfer money across the border. So from Canada to US, whatever, you can do it straight through the bank, just like kind of one step, super fast. But also what this meant is that my US agency, who gets paid in US from my publisher, and they send me my payments, they were able to wire me the US payments to that US account. And because that happened, it didn't put, because it's US money going into a US account, it doesn't put a hold on it. And because I have a cross-border account, when I transfer that US money to my Canadian account, it doesn't put a hold on it because it's coming from me. So that was something like mind-blowing that made a huge difference to me and was really helpful. It was also fantastic because then when I traveled to the US to do stuff, I was able to use my cross-border account. So I was able to use debit in US. I was able to use my US credit card. It was also helpful because when I used my US credit card and I had to expense things back to my publisher or expense things otherwise, it was all on one card. But yeah, it just made my life so much simpler. When I went to the US, I could take out cash from my cross-border account in USD. So I didn't have to worry about like having to exchange a bunch of cash before I traveled. It was just like super convenient. And it made my life a million times easier. So if you're a Canadian, again, I'm not a banking financial expert, but if you're a Canadian, I would definitely contact your bank and look into cross-border accounting if you are receiving funds from like a US publishers or from your US agency. It simplified my life infinitely. It was just so much better. So that was like another big learning in 2022 that made a big difference for me because I no longer had to wait when I got my payments. I just received them right away. And it also just made things really simple for when I was traveling. And especially, you know, if you expect to be traveling a little bit more to the US to be doing book things, it's really nice. So that was great. And that was kind of the final learning. But yeah, that was it. Hopefully this video was interesting to you. If it wasn't like necessarily helpful or relevant to you, I find these sorts of things like really interesting and like I'm really compelled by them, which is why I make these videos. So I hope that it's interesting to you too. If you have any questions for me, you can put them in the comments and I will try to answer to the best of my ability. If I can't answer for some reason because it's like a confidential thing with my book contracts that I can't talk about, or if it's just like a too personal money thing that I can't talk about, I'll just say so. And I'm sorry for that, but it is for my own privacy and like in the case of contract confidentiality, for the sake of the contract. So, but I will try my absolute best. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.